folks. My guest today is Mr. Art Bell, and not the science fiction supernatural radio host, Art Bell, who is the new author of Constant Comedy, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And the book is available on Amazon and all of your local bookstores, everywhere if you still using brick and mortar. And his website, artbellwriter.com, where you can find out certainly much more about him. But I'm really pleased that, Art, you're joining me today. Thank you very much. How are you, Art, and how are we doing?
You know something? Just got to stay in the house. That's my rule.
I think that those of us, and certainly I was never an executive to the level of your being a founder and a CEO, but I've done network work. And I was going to say, for those of us in broadcasting, we're kind of used to sitting in little cubicles and just kind of doing our own thing,
Yeah, right. It's true.
It's not exactly like I'm running around having to do things out on the street for 10 hours a day. So
yes. Plus, I've been writing for the last few years. So talk about sitting in one place and not worrying about it. That's what I've been doing.
I just find it so phenomenal that, when we talk about people that have got a creative idea and they go, gee, I think I'll go ahead and start a network. And I know many who have tried, but at the end of the day, when we look at you and what you've done with Comedy Central, and I know it wasn't called Comedy Central when you got it going, but it turned into becoming, shall we say, a venerable provider of what now is the leading late night talk show hosts and so many icons of, a lot of people would go get the news for, you've got Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart, of course, is a spearhead, Trevor Noah. Many people started going to Comedy Central to get their news rather than going to ABC, CBS, and what people used to rely in the old school as reliable sources of news. And it seemed like, how did it become that kind of a meteoric rise to say it's not only comedy, but it's where we get our truth in the news?
It is amazing. And it's also very satisfying to me because when I was originally pitching this and when I was trying to get it started, I really was hoping and saying to myself and others that, this comedy network would change the world in some way someday. I mostly thought of that in regard to comedy and people's enthusiasm about enjoying it. But, the fact that we got into news and topical coverage as early as we did, that's in the early 90s, just a couple of years after we launched, I think that was definitely a step in the right direction and one we always intended to take. But you're right. I will say I am amazed and gratified that young people, especially who didn't otherwise take an active interest in the news or current events, started tuning into Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. And you know what? That's a credit to Jon Stewart as well. I got to say, if it was just anybody, I think it wouldn't have gotten the attention that it did. But Jon was the right guy and the right kind of comedian for the job. And he really made it work.
So I know we're going to get into the meat of your book. In launching what you first saw, and this wasn't Comedy Central at the time, it was another channel, and somehow you partnered up with another carrier of channels. You want to get into that story a little bit about what was on your mind and how did you go about just finding out a roster of comics and comedians that would join you in this enterprise?
Well, the story starts when I was a kid. I loved comedy. Well, fast forward to college when I had to make a decision on what I was going to do with my life. And I had studied economics. So I took a job as an economist and spent 3 years in Washington as an economist. After 3 years, I sort of said, you know what? I love television. I really love comedy. I want to get into that. Maybe I should do something about it. And I went back to school and I went to business school. And when I came out, I looked around. It was the early 80s, early to mid 80s. And I said, how come there's no comedy network here? There's an all sports network. There's an all music network. There's an all lots of things network. And there's no all comedy network. What's up with that? Because that's where I wanted to work. So when I got to HBO, and by the way, I got to HBO because I had been an economist. They were looking for somebody to do, I know that's kind of funny. They were looking for somebody to do financial and economic forecasting. And as my friend who called me from HBO said, I think you're the only guy in the industry who knows anything about econometrics and economic forecasting. So I went to HBO with that job. And when I got there, I started talking kind of casually to people about, like, comedy channel. Why don't you guys start? Why doesn't HBO start a comedy channel? And I was pretty much rebuffed for a bunch of reasons. I wasn't taken seriously until finally I was. And one of the things I write about in the book early on is an early meeting I had with the head of programming at HBO. And I didn't know her, but I did want to pitch her thinking, okay, if anybody takes me seriously, it would be her. So I went in, had a meeting, I pitched her, and she just said, no, that's the worst idea in the world. No, nobody wants a 24-hour comedy network, and there's no comedians who would be on a 24-hour comedy network. And she basically, threw me out of her office. Not, she wasn't rude about it, but she did, that was the end of it.
By the way, there's the door.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for all your help. So but as I went back to my office, I realized she was wrong. She was just wrong. There was going to be a comedy network, and I did not understand how HBO would let that opportunity go by. Because at the time, HBO was doing some of the best comedy on TV. They were doing 1-hour uncut specials, uncensored specials with Robin Williams and Whoopi Goldberg and Robert Klein and all of those guys. You couldn't see that stuff on television anywhere. You had to go to a club to see Robin Williams do his act. So that was pretty impressive. But finally, through some luck and pluck, I ended up in the office of the chairman of HBO, Michael Fuchs. My boss's boss caught me sort of working on a write-up of what I thought Comedy Channel should be. And he said, what's this? And I said, well, it's a write-up for a comedy channel. Nobody's really taking me seriously, but I thought I'd write it down. And he said, well, come on, let's go talk to the chairman. Now, I was a junior guy working as a marketing and financial analyst. If I got into the elevator with Michael Fuchs, I'd break into a sweat. He was one of the most powerful guys in Hollywood. So, my boss's boss took me to his office right then. I went in, no presentation materials, no preparation, and I pitched the channel. And I think my enthusiasm and my passion, the fact that I've been thinking about it for 5 years or whatever, got me through. And 15 minutes later, he said, okay, well, let's explore this further. And we did. And I gave a big presentation a few months later, and they said go. And that's how we got into it.
The reference to your programming director that you had met to that said, nobody's going to want to do it. I would take an issue with that to say that when this first got going, relatively speaking, it was, shall we say, for just the sheer volume of production. How difficult was it to get 1 hour of comedians by putting either one camera, two camera, three cameras in a room with these people and say, as far as cost of production versus sitcom or all of the other formats, this is relatively inexpensive just to be able to get the content in here, right?
Yeah, well, that was kind of the secret to getting us into business. One of the reasons people said you couldn't have a comedy network is because they thought it was very expensive. Well, it was expensive to put any kind of network together in those days because you needed, satellite uplink facilities and lots of infrastructure, but HBO had that. But they were a little daunted by the cost of production, not only of stand-up comedy, but of all the other comedy that you just mentioned. So what I suggested was we take existing comedy from either stand-up shows or from comedy movies, comedy television, anything we could find, take scenes from that, short-form comedy, and put that on the air as clips and add that to, what I assume would be a good roster of some sitcoms and some movies and some original programming. And as time would go by, we'd do a more original programming as we got more successful. That's pretty much what happened. Although while we originally had permission to use clips and we had to get permission from the unions, the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild and all the other guilds. And they originally gave us permission because they thought it would be great, that it would be promotional for the movies or television that we were taking the clips from. The Directors Guild changed their mind at the last minute, about 8 weeks before we launched. So all the clips that we had, we couldn't use. Yeah, imagine my disappointment. So I had to scramble for a plan B, and we did drag as much programming as we could into the situation. Luckily, there was a lot of stand-up obviously already produced and had been produced over the years because comedy clubs all over the country, either they had one camera going or two cameras, one way or the other, they were taping as much as they could of their acts. So there were lots and lots. There was lots of footage of comedians, some of whom became quite famous, doing their acts, and we scoured the earth and found as much and licensed as much of that as we could, and that was helpful. Also, even before we launched, Mystery Science Theater 3000 came in the mail. Uh, it was a show that was being done as kind of a lark by some guys in Minneapolis, and the show was, watching. It was Joel Hodgson and a comedian and two of his robot friends watching bad movies and making jokes about them while the movie was playing.
Yeah, I remember that. It was a great show.
It still is a great show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it
if you
is.
can believe this, it's still on the air. It's gone to other networks. It's gone. I think Netflix is doing it now. I mean, it's just one of the best shows and longest lasting shows in comedy these days. And um, it came in the mail. We immediately made a deal for it. So right off the bat, we had something I thought could be a big deal, a big hit for us, and it was. Early on, it was a cult hit for us. So that was good news.
Yeah, that's tremendous. I mean, it's just so many ways that you folks were able to establish what was going to become so many cultural icons on, in what we call mass market entertainment. So HBO got this going. They announced their plans to launch a comedy channel, and obviously you were onto something because along came the competitors. MTV announced a competitor, right? About this time that HBO made the plans to launch the
Right.
comedy channel. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, we'd been working on the channel for 4 or 5 months, and Michael Fuchs, the chairman, said, "Okay, we are going to do a big announcement party for this thing, and in LA." And he did, and he was very, enthusiastic. We're going to make a lot of money. It's going to be the best channel anybody ever saw. He really put it out there. A day later, a day after that press conference, MTV Networks announced that they too were launching a comedy network, and they were going to call it Ha, the Comedy Network. And they ended up launching 6 months after we did. Now, I'm pretty sure they didn't have a whole lot of interest in launching a comedy network until they heard that we were, and then thought, we better get into the act here. And that made me laugh a little bit because 6 months earlier, there were no comedy channels in the world, and people thought it was a bad idea. Suddenly, there's two, and we went head to head with them for 6 months. We were competing for programming and for audience and for cable distribution and for advertisers. I mean, it was pretty crazy, and it was almost personal, certainly from the point of view of those of us in the trenches. And
I was going to ask you, is that Sumner Redstone's Viacom in those days or not yet?
yes, oh, that was exactly it. That was Sumner Redstone's Viacom. They got to remember.
You owned
Here's a
everything under
little.
the sun.
Here's something you probably know. Sumner Redstone's Viacom had Showtime, which was HBO's arch enemy in the pay TV business. And Viacom also owned MTV. So it was easy to take these guys on as arch enemies and make it personal because, HBO didn't like Viacom in the first place. So that's what happened. And but at the end of the year, we'd been competing, and I thought we were winning. We had a bigger audience. We had a better concept. I thought, listen, I'll go through the whole thing. You always think you're winning. But they said we were going to merge. Michael got together with Frank Biondi, who was the head of Viacom at that point under Sumner. And they knew each other. And they said, look, we're going to beat each other into oblivion here. Why don't we just merge and see if that works? And that's what they did. And they called me up, and I was, of course, very disappointed. But they put me together with my opposite number, the programming head for Ha. And they said, okay, you guys figure it out. Figure out what this channel is going to be called, what kind of programming it's going to have, what it's going to be about, and good luck. So that's what we did.
Well, when you talk about passion and dreams and creating something, and then the rarity of it really happening, and then you get to actually oversee its meteoric rise, and then you take a look at a merger. So I'm going to ask you, the book, Constant Comedy, how I started Comedy Central, and we'll get into how it changed its name, et cetera. But you've just touched on the whole merging with the other network and everything else. So your subtitle, How I Lost My Sense of Humor. So I'm starting to see it already, but where did your subtitle come from for your book? And did you really lose your sense of humor?
Well, I would say I lost my sense of humor for a minute. Here's where the subtitle came from. You talk about our meteoric rise after the launch. Let me tell you, the first year after we launched Comedy Channel, it was widely considered a failure, certainly the first 6 months. I mean, we didn't have enough programming, as I pointed out. We didn't really know what a comedy channel was all about. We were sort of making it up as we went along. I mean, I had plans and everything, but plans sometimes go awry. So we were constantly trying to figure out what to do to make things better. And about 3 or 4 months into it, Michael Fuchs, again, the chairman of HBO, called me into his office. He was very disappointed, to say the least. He was very disappointed. And he said to me, Art, it took a comedy channel to get me to lose my sense of humor. And that was the story about losing my sense of humor.
That's really phenomenal, and I get it. So, but on the turnaround, when did you and everybody involved know that the channel was going to be a success?
Well, that's almost a different question. I mean, starting with me, I knew the channel was going to be a success when two things happened. One, Mystery Science Theater 3000 came in the door. Now, why was that significant? Because I always assumed that if there were a comedy channel in the world, then innovative comedy that couldn't show up anywhere else would start showing up with us. And there it was, right off the bat. Mystery Science Theater 3000 wasn't going to get on NBC or HBO or anywhere else until we came along. Suddenly there was a place they could put it. The second thing is, I was told by the head of programming that comedians wouldn't want to be on the channel. And that was sort of wrong, because almost immediately the comedy world was flattered that we were throwing a comedy network on their behalf. I mean, not nobody, but it was a way that we were recognizing what they did as an art form akin to music or, other things that deserved a whole channel. And they started hanging out with us, and they started coming to find us when they had good ideas for programming or, wanted to be on the channel. They literally started hanging out at the channel as we were putting it together. And those two things made me think, okay, one way or another, this is a good idea, and this is an idea that will last. As for everybody else, I think at the end of the year, I think there was some skepticism as to whether the world would really end up with a comedy network. That said, by the end of the year, we had really attracted an audience, and surprisingly, the audience was younger. When we went to talk to advertisers or cable executives, and we said, we really think you ought to launch this or advertise something, and they'd say, you know what, we looked at it, we don't get it, we don't think it's funny, but my teenage son thinks it's a riot and watches it all the time. So that was another potential sign of success. When we went into the merger and became Comedy Central, we renamed it. It was, I wouldn't say it was immediately successful, but at least we had resources. We had programming from both sides, which was a lot more programming than one channel needed, whereas both channels were kind of like running a little thin before. So that was very helpful. And, while there were two different cultures, one from HBO and one from MTV Networks coming together, both sides really wanted to see a comedy network in existence, meaning me, my opposite number, the people working on the channels, everybody was of the same mind. We wanted to make this thing a success. And so we did.
Okay, so now obviously we're talking about the people involved underneath the brand and underneath what I'll call airwaves, even though it was cable, of course, now internet. And we've seen mergers before. As an example, the Sirius versus XM, in the 90s, and then you have them combined, and now they've got such a glut of content. Now you're into an editorial process to say, we got to start casting the overages aside because we only have so much bandwidth or we only have so many hours on the clock. Then you're actually talking about people working together, different corporate cultures. Let's come back to your book. the real people involved. What was it like writing about the real people in your story? And did you do a lot of research for the book? But you were there in the front line. So did you need to do a lot of research? Are you drawing from real experiences? And what was it like writing about the real people involved?
The book is a memoir, and it's really based on how I remember things and how I experienced the whole startup of the channel and the merger and all the things we did to make it successful. So I didn't feel that I had to do any research or much research. I did have lunch with a couple of people from the old days just to jog my memory about a couple of things I wanted to write about. But for the most part, and I checked dates occasionally just to make sure I wasn't messing that up too much. But for the most part, I remembered a lot of what had gone on, because it really was my greatest adventure, certainly in my career. And it was emblazoned into really kind of into my memory. And I had no trouble remembering most of it, I have to say. As for writing about real people, that was, including myself, for that matter, that was a little bit daunting, because not only about the people who you're portraying not so well, and there were only a couple of those in the book, and I think I was fairly gentle to everybody because it was a creative enterprise and things happen and there were disagreements and everything. But especially for the people I loved and loved working with, who I really wanted to celebrate to a certain extent with this book, I wanted to make sure I wasn't messing that up too much. And it was akin to sketching. I mean, that's how I came to think of it. When you have a sketch pad and you try and make a sketch of somebody and you show it to them and you want them to say, hey, yeah, that's good. That looks like me. Yeah, I get it. I wanted that to be everybody's reaction who was in the book. Yeah, that you got me, or even better, other people saying, you really captured that person, the way that person was. And I worked very hard on that. And I think for the most part, I was successful.
That's good to hear. And how has the book been received in terms of now that it's out in the world? And has anything surprised you?
Well, I was surprised to hear from so many people that I hadn't heard from in a long time who read the book and liked the book. People in the industry, people, of course, some people in the book, old friends from college. I mean, just, it got, and everybody is very positive about the book, as you can imagine. But I think the most surprising part was the fact that, despite the fact that it's not really a business book, it is about entrepreneurship, or in my case, intrapreneurship, meaning starting a business within a business, which is very hard to do. And I got a lot of attention from people in business. There's something called the Entrepreneurship Institute in Denver, and they found me pretty quickly and had me talk to some of their classes and taped me and gave out my book. I mean, they were really supportive and really excited to find me. And then I've also talked to students at film schools and business schools, and I'm continuing to do that. And it's amazing how interested the students are, especially students who want to get into the television industry, about, they see the book as a real close look at what goes on behind the scenes in the television business. It really is a fly on the wall kind of approach to what happened. And so they've been, really enthusiastic about hearing about the book and then ultimately reading the book. I've heard from them, a lot of students subsequently. So that was the surprise. I actually got invited to a couple of venture capital conferences as well for the same reason. They just wanted to hear about what it's like to start up a business. So that's been surprising.
Yeah, I would imagine. And yet there's a parable in there that because of your back history as a financial analyst, what happens when the financial analyst sees comedy? And I guess there's a parable in that for modern day living, considering what we're all going through right now.
I think that's right. I think one of the things that people take away from it, or I want them to take away from it, is that, you don't have to start your career where you want to end your career necessarily. You just got to keep moving towards where you want to end up. And the second thing, and maybe more importantly, is that everything you do in your career, everything you've done before, is helpful to you. I mean, in my case, it was finance and economics, which got me into HBO. But not only that, gave me a real good understanding of how business worked, because I didn't know how comedy worked. I didn't know how the comedy business worked when I walked into it, but I learned that. And so all of those things, everything I did was helpful for the next thing I did or the next job or whatever it was. And I think I found that very interesting.
So are you finding art personal satisfaction? I mean, obviously, I think when people have a book out and they've got it done and it's completed and it's in the world, and there's a real great sense of self satisfaction and success in that. And your book now, I mean, what's next for Mr. Art Bell? Are you happy with the arc of your life and having culminated with this beautiful network that has made such significant impact? Are you content now being the writer author? What's next on your agenda?
Well, as far as looking in my rearview mirror and seeing Comedy Central thriving and becoming the cultural icon that it has, and being around for 30 years, I mean that is a source of pride. As far as what I'm doing, I'm mostly writing now, and I'm also doing the things I just talked about. I am really working hard to talk to more students and to more people interested in my experience, in order for them to learn from what I went through and help start their careers or further their careers. So it's a combination of writing. I'm promoting the book right now, obviously, but also doing more of that speaking. And I will, continue to write. I am writing memoir. I'm writing fiction. I found I like writing a lot. So this is a good thing to be doing right now.
So you're content and happy being Art Bell the writer, or artbellwriter.com, which is where people can find you.
Yeah, they can find out about me and about the book. They can buy the book on Amazon or at their local bookstore, and I hope they do.
Okay. And, I'm going to ask you one other top of mind question before I let you go, which is in today's, I'm not even going to call it the emerging media. I mean, we are in a splashdown explosion of OTT internet channels. And every time you flip on a TCL, a Roku, a Fire Stick, an Apple, whatever it is, there's the next plethora of 3,000 channels, which seems to be, it's the Wild West. It's carnivore at best because it's dog eat dog. But if somebody wanted to start their own channel, and I'm not necessarily talking about this proletariat idea, but you started with an inspiration. You said, I love comedy. How come there's no full-time comedy? And there you go. Comedy Channel became Comedy Central. And if somebody was going to start a network today in your eyes, and of course, being a financial analyst from the past on a business level, do you have any insight or advice as to what you would do for somebody having any idea to start another channel or a network today?
Well, the beauty of technology today is it's digital. And I think around 2006, 2007, I started saying to people in the industry, you know what? You can start a channel in your garage now. You don't need satellite distribution because we've got instant distribution. So I think the financial requirements to start a channel are a lot different now. Sure, you got the big guys who are doing the over-the-top stuff, and they've got a lot of programming. But you see what's going on in YouTube. I mean, people are basically programming their own channels. Some of them are becoming famous in their own right. And I think that is going to be a continual source of talent and a way to get audience that isn't very expensive and can be very lucrative. So, looking across the landscape, you don't have to get yourself on the dial on television to be a channel. That's I think, a terrific thing.
And I think the good news as far as our genre that we're talking about today here, comedy, it's probably a little bit more interesting to look at the internet being the comedy room where you don't have to bring in your 3 minutes of time and bring in 18 people to buy alcohol and we'll give you your 3 minutes on the stage. Now the internet is the stage and you've got a lot more room to run.
That's right.
Excellent. Okay, well, Art Bell today, thank you so much. The book, Constant Comedy, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And it is available on Amazon and all the local bookstores as well, everywhere. And his website, artbellwriter.com, where you can find certainly much more about Art, his book, and I guess engagements, consulting, various other things that you love to do. Speaking, right, Art?
Absolutely. If anybody wants me to speak, especially to, classes, business classes, film classes, I am very happy to do that.
artbellwriter.com. Go visit Art, and thanks so much for your time today, Art. I'm glad that you've been able to at least hang a little bit with me, and good to spend some time getting to know you. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate it too. It was fun.
Good. We'll do it again sometime. You stay well.
You too.